The day I came back home should have been a joyful one. After 3 grueling years serving in the army, all I wanted was the comfort of my wife's arms and the warmth of a home I'd fought to protect. The small Montana town where I grew up hadn't changed much. Same dusty roads, same old faces. My wife, Emily, met me at the airport with a smile so wide it almost made me forget the horrors I'd seen overseas. She looked perfect, radiant even, as if she'd been waiting for me her whole life. My brother, Carter, a rising star in the country music world, was there too, strumming his guitar and singing a song he'd written for my homecoming. Everything seemed fine on the surface, but as the celebration went on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was off. Emily clung to my arm, yet her eyes darted to Carter more times than I could count. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just adjusting to being back. After all, Carter and Emily had always been close. That night, as I lay in bed with Emily, I couldn't sleep. She was right next to me, but she felt miles away. I brushed it off. I was tired, out of sync with civilian life. But something deep inside whispered, "Jack, pay attention." Life after my return settled into a rhythm, though it was more of a disjointed melody than a harmonious tune. Emily seemed eager to help me adjust, always asking if I needed anything, always putting on a show of concern. But her actions didn't match her words. She started spending more time on her phone, texting with a grin that vanished whenever I entered the room. Her laughter echoed from behind closed doors, and I couldn't help but feel like an outsider in my own home. Then there was Carter. He began showing up more often than usual, offering to help with anything I needed. He was always friendly, always smiling that easy, charismatic smile he used on stage. And while I tried to dismiss the unease gnawing at me, I couldn't help but notice the way Emily's face lit up when he was around. One afternoon, I came home earlier than expected. Emily was sitting on the couch, her phone in hand. The moment she heard the door, she jumped as though I'd caught her doing something she shouldn't. "Hey, you're back early," she said, forcing a smile. "Yeah, finished up sooner than I thought," I replied, studying her face. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She quickly grabbed it, but not before I saw the name on the screen. "Carter. My brother." "Is that Carter?" I asked casually. "Oh, yeah," she said too quickly. "He was just checking in." The pit in my stomach grew heavier. I knew Carter and Emily were friends. Hell, they'd known each other long before I introduced them. But this felt different. The cracks widened when Carter invited us to one of his shows a few weeks later. Emily insisted we go, saying it would be good for me to get out and enjoy myself. At the venue, I watched them interact. Their conversations were lively, filled with inside jokes and laughter that excluded me entirely. At one point, Carter leaned in close to her, whispering something that made her blush. I clenched my fists, my jaw tightening as I fought the urge to confront them right then and there. But I didn't. Not yet. Later that night, I tried to talk to Emily about how distant she'd seemed. She brushed me off, blaming my worries on the adjustment period after my deployment. "You're overthinking things," she said, kissing me lightly on the cheek. But her reassurance felt hollow. The doubt clawed at me like a wild animal, growing stronger with every passing day. I wanted to believe her, to trust her. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. Carter was hosting a party to celebrate the release of his latest album. It was a big deal, a gathering of friends, family, and a few of his industry contacts. Emily was thrilled, talking endlessly about how proud she was of him. I wanted to share her enthusiasm, but the unease I'd been carrying weighed heavily on me. That night, Emily wore a dress I hadn't seen before, deep red, fitting her like a glove. She looked stunning, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pride. But as soon as we arrived at Carter's house, that pride turned to bitterness. The house was buzzing with life. People laughing, music playing, the smell of barbecue drifting through the air. Carter greeted us at the door with his trademark charm, pulling Emily into a hug that lasted just a second too long. "Glad you two made it," he said, patting me on the back. "This night wouldn't be the same without you." Inside, I watched as Emily and Carter drifted together, like magnets drawn to one another. It wasn't obvious. Not enough to cause a scene, but I noticed every lingering glance, every casual touch. When Carter sang a song dedicated to finding inspiration in the people you love, Emily's eyes sparkled as though he'd written it just for her. I tried to shake off my suspicions, drowning them in a glass of bourbon. Maybe I was being paranoid. Maybe the war had messed with my head more than I realized. But then I saw them. It was subtle at first. Carter leaning in to whisper something in Emily's ear. She giggled, her cheeks flushing. His hand brushed her arm, lingering there as they exchanged smiles that felt too intimate for my liking. Later in the evening, Emily approached me, a hand on her stomach. "I'm not feeling great," she said softly. "I think I need to head home." "Want me to take you?" I asked, setting down my drink. No, she insisted, glancing toward Carter. "You should stay. Carter can drop me off. It's no trouble." My gut twisted. Everything inside me screamed not to let her go, but I forced a smile. "All right," I said, pretending not to care. As they left, I stood by the window watching Carter's car pull out of the driveway. The bourbon I'd been sipping burned in my chest, but it was nothing compared to the fire of suspicion raging inside me. I grabbed my jacket, my heart pounding as I decided to follow them. Whatever was happening, I needed to know the truth. I followed Carter's car at a safe distance, my headlights off as I trailed them through the quiet streets of our small Montana town. The night was cold, and the air inside my truck felt heavy, like a storm was about to break. They didn't head toward our house. Instead, Carter's car turned onto a dimly lit back road that led to a small motel just outside of town. My heart raced, each beat hammering against my ribs. This couldn't be happening. Pulling into the parking lot a few moments after them, I parked my truck in the shadows, far enough away to remain unseen. I watched as Carter stepped out, walked around to the passenger side, and opened the door for Emily. She stepped out slowly, her body language nervous, but she didn't resist when he placed his hand on the small of her back. They didn't even glance around to check if anyone was watching. Bold, reckless. My jaw tightened as I watched them walk to one of the rooms, Carter using a key to unlock the door. Emily hesitated for a moment at the threshold but eventually stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind them. My grip on the steering wheel was so tight my knuckles turned white. Every fiber of my being wanted to storm up to that door, kick it down, and confront them. But something stopped me. Maybe it was disbelief. Maybe it was the hope that this was all a misunderstanding. Or maybe it was the cold, calculated voice in the back of my mind telling me to wait. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, staring at that closed door. The parking lot was eerily silent, the neon motel sign flickering faintly in the darkness. Inside my head, memories of Emily and me flashed like a cruel slideshow. Our wedding day, her laugh, the promises we'd made. All of it felt like a lie now. Eventually, the door opened. Emily stepped out first, her hair slightly disheveled, her face flushed. She glanced around nervously before heading back to the car. Carter followed, looking far too casual for someone who had just betrayed his own brother. I stayed in the shadows, watching as they drove away. My body was frozen, a storm of emotions churning inside me. Rage, heartbreak, betrayal. By the time I drove home, the sun was beginning to rise, casting an ironic golden light over a morning that felt anything but hopeful. When I walked into the house, it was empty. Emily hadn't come home. The bed was untouched, and her side of the closet looked eerily neat, as though she'd planned for this. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at my wedding ring. It felt heavy in my hand, a symbol of a love that had been stolen from me. But this wasn't just about Emily. It was about Carter, too, the man I'd trusted with my life, the brother I'd looked up to. As the morning light streamed through the window, I made a decision. This wasn't going to end here. They'd taken something from me, and now it was my turn. The hours after that night were a blur. I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty space across from me where Emily usually had her morning coffee. The silence of the house was deafening, a cruel reminder that my life was no longer what it had been just a day ago. She didn't come home that morning. By noon, I'd stopped checking the clock and started focusing on what I needed to do. This wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation. A slap in the face from the two people I trusted most. But I wasn't going to break. Not yet. First, I needed confirmation. As much as it hurt, I couldn't rely on assumptions. I searched through Emily's things, her drawers, her phone, her laptop. What I found didn't surprise me, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. Texts between her and Carter, filled with innuendos and flirtation, along with photos and voice messages that left no doubt about their relationship. Each message was another dagger, twisting deeper into the wounds they'd already inflicted. One in particular caught my eye, a message from Carter saying, "Last night was incredible. I wish I didn't have to sneak around, but it's worth it for you." That was all I needed. The dam inside me broke, but instead of tears, it was a flood of cold, calculated rage. When Emily finally walked through the door late that afternoon, she didn't look guilty. If anything, she looked relieved, like someone who had finally made peace with a terrible decision. She barely met my eyes as she set her purse on the counter. "Hey," she said casually, as if everything was normal. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Out," she replied, avoiding my gaze. I needed some air. I stood up, walking toward her with deliberate slowness. "And Carter? Did he need air too?" Her head snapped up, her eyes widening. For a split second, she looked panicked, but she quickly masked it with indifference. "What are you talking about? Don't insult me," I growled, holding up my phone with the incriminating texts displayed on the screen. Her face drained of color, and for the first time she looked genuinely afraid. "Jack, she started, but I cut her off. "Save it," I said, my voice cold. "I don't want your excuses. I don't want your apologies. You've made your choices, Emily. Now, I'm making mine." I walked past her, pulling open a drawer where I'd placed a folder of divorce papers earlier that day. I slammed them onto the counter, the sound echoing in the quiet kitchen. My wedding ring sat on top of the folder, a final punctuation to the end of what we once had. Her eyes welled up with tears as she looked at the papers, but I felt no sympathy. Whatever she was feeling now, it was nothing compared to the betrayal she and Carter had orchestrated behind my back. "You can sign them now or later." "I don't care," I said, heading toward the door. "But when I get back, I don't want to see you here." "Jack, wait," she called after me, but I didn't stop. I walked out of the house, slamming the door behind me. As I sat in my truck, gripping the steering wheel, I felt an odd sense of clarity. This wasn't just about ending my marriage. This was about reclaiming my dignity, my pride. And I wasn't going to stop with Emily. Carter had taken something from me, too. He thought he could get away with it because of his charm, his fame. But he was wrong. I was a soldier, and if there was one thing I'd learned in the army, it was how to take down an enemy. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet preparation. Emily moved out, leaving behind a house that now felt cold and hollow. I didn't care where she went. She was no longer my concern. My focus was on Carter now. He'd betrayed me in the worst way possible, and while Emily's actions cut deep, it was his betrayal that burned like fire in my chest. He wasn't just my brother. He was someone I'd protected my entire life. As kids, I stood up for him when bullies came around. As adults, I cheered him on when he chased his dreams of becoming a musician. And this was how he repaid me. But I wasn't going to confront him in a fit of rage. That would be too easy, too predictable. No, Carter needed to feel the consequences of his actions, not just in his personal life but in the world he'd built for himself. His career, his reputation. He needed to lose everything he valued, just as I had. I started gathering intel, piecing together every bit of leverage I could find. His career as a country music star had taken off in recent years, and with that success came secrets. I reached out to a few contacts I still had from my military days, people who could dig deeper than a civilian ever could. What I found was exactly what I needed. Carter's charming public persona was a mask, hiding a string of indiscretions. Women he'd slept with on the road, contracts he'd broken, and tax filings that raised more than a few red flags. But I didn't stop there. I needed something more personal, something that would strike at the core of who he was. That's when I stumbled upon an old recording. A demo tape Carter had recorded years ago. The melody was hauntingly familiar, and it didn't take long for me to place it. It was a song I'd written during my deployment, one I'd shared with him in a letter. He'd stolen it, claiming it as his own. That was the breaking point. I spent the next few days creating a plan. It wasn't enough to expose Carter's secrets. I needed to do it in a way that would destroy him publicly, in front of the fans and industry insiders who adored him. I would use his success against him, turning his world upside down. The opportunity came in the form of a charity event Carter was headlining. It was a high-profile gala, attended by celebrities, executives, and fans. Carter was slated to perform his biggest hits, including the stolen song. I knew I had to be there. I contacted the event organizers under a pseudonym, offering to sponsor a portion of the event in exchange for access to the stage. With the right connections and a carefully crafted story, I secured my spot. No one suspected a thing. The night of the gala, I dressed in my sharpest suit and arrived early. As I stood in the crowd, watching Carter work the room with his easy charm, I felt an odd sense of calm. He had no idea what was coming. As his performance began, I waited for the perfect moment. When he launched into the stolen song, I made my move, walking onto the stage with a microphone in hand. The crowd gasped, unsure of what was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I'd like to tell you a story about betrayal, theft, and the truth behind the man you see before you." Carter's face went pale, and for the first time in years, I saw fear in his eyes. The room fell silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. The spotlight shifted from Carter to me, illuminating the raw tension in the air. I held the microphone tightly, my heartbeat steady as I prepared to dismantle his carefully constructed world. "Carter," I said, locking eyes with him, "this song you're performing, it's beautiful, isn't it? A song about love, loss, and redemption. But there's something the audience deserves to know. This song, it isn't yours." A ripple of confusion swept through the crowd. Carter's smile faltered, and he took a step toward me, his voice laced with panic. "Jack, what are you doing?" Ignoring him, I addressed the audience. "You see, I wrote this song during my deployment. It was a personal piece, one I shared with my brother in a letter while I was overseas. Imagine my surprise when I came home and heard it on the radio, credited to him." Gasps erupted from the crowd. Carter's fans, executives, and industry colleagues exchanged uneasy glances. Whispers turned into murmurs, and Carter's composure began to crack. "Jack, that's enough," Carter said, his voice strained. "No, Carter," I shot back. "It's not enough. Not yet." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a USB drive. On this drive are the original recordings of the song, dated years before Carter's version was ever released. And that's not all. There are also emails, correspondence between Carter and his manager, where they discuss how to spin the narrative if the truth ever came out. The murmurs grew louder. Carter's face turned a deep shade of red, and he stepped toward me, his voice low and desperate. "We can talk about this privately." "Privately?" I echoed, raising an eyebrow. "You mean the way you and Emily handled things privately?" That did it. The room erupted into chaos. People shouted questions, demanding explanations. Carter froze, unable to contain the growing tide of outrage. I turned to the crowd once more, my voice steady despite the turmoil around me. "I didn't come here tonight to ruin anyone's career. I came here for the truth. You all deserve to know who you're supporting, who you're celebrating. Because it's not just about me. It's about every person Carter has lied to, used, or betrayed." Security guards began approaching the stage, their radios crackling as they tried to control the situation. But the damage was done. Carter's carefully curated image was crumbling before everyone's eyes. As I stepped off the stage, Carter grabbed my arm, his grip tight. "Why are you doing this to me?" he hissed. I met his gaze, my voice cold. "You did this to yourself, Carter. You betrayed me, stole from me, and thought you could get away with it. Now you get to live with the consequences." I walked out of the venue, leaving Carter to face the fallout. The night air was crisp, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of relief. The pain of betrayal hadn't disappeared, but I'd taken back control. Behind me, I could hear the roar of the crowd, the unraveling of Carter's career. He'd taken so much from me, but tonight, I'd taken something back. The morning after the gala, the world was buzzing. News outlets, social media, and entertainment blogs exploded with headlines. Carter Willis exposed, stolen song scandal rocks country music star, and family betrayal goes public at charity event. Clips of my confrontation at the gala were everywhere, replayed on endless loops for millions to see. I wasn't naive. I knew the media would devour this story like vultures. But that was part of the plan. Carter had built his career on lies and charm, and I wanted the world to see him for who he really was. At home, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls, texts, emails. Some from friends offering support, others from people I hadn't spoken to in years, eager for the full story. I ignored most of them. I wasn't doing this for attention. Emily hadn't reached out, and I didn't expect her to. She was likely lying low, trying to figure out how to salvage her own reputation. Part of me wondered if she'd stand by Carter through the fallout, but another part of me didn't care. They deserved each other. By midday, Carter released a statement through his publicist. It was a carefully worded apology, full of vague acknowledgments and promises to reflect and grow. But he didn't admit to stealing the song outright, nor did he address the betrayal. Instead, he painted himself as a victim of misunderstandings and family tensions. It wasn't enough. The backlash was swift and merciless. Fans were outraged, boycotting his music and flooding his social media with angry comments. Sponsors began pulling their support, and rumors swirled that his label was considering dropping him altogether. As for me, I felt a bittersweet satisfaction watching it all unfold. This wasn't revenge for the sake of revenge. It was justice. Carter had spent years taking what wasn't his, building his success on the backs of others. Now he was finally facing the consequences. But the fallout wasn't just public. That evening, I got a call from my mother. She'd seen the news, of course, and her voice was heavy with disappointment. "Jack," she began, "was this really necessary? Couldn't you have handled this privately?" Her words stung more than I'd expected. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "you don't know the whole story." "Then tell me," she urged, "because all I see is two sons tearing each other apart in front of the world." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. In the end, I told her everything. The affair, the stolen song, the lies. Her silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I don't know what to say," she finally admitted. "I'm disappointed in both of you." Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. I'd done what I felt was right, but it was a painful reminder that in war, whether on the battlefield or in a family, there were always casualties. That night, I sat alone in the quiet of my living room, replaying the events of the past few weeks. The anger that had driven me was starting to fade, replaced by a deep, aching sadness. I had exposed Carter and taken back my dignity. But at what cost? I thought about the future, about what came next. This wasn't the end of my story, just the end of a chapter. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to hope. The days that followed were strange. The anger that had driven me for so long had dissipated, leaving an emptiness in its place. I'd spent so much energy fighting betrayal, lies, and the ghosts of what I thought my life was. Now that the dust was settling, I wasn't sure what to do next. Carter's world continued to unravel. News outlets dug deeper into his past, uncovering more scandals, affairs, broken contracts, and debts he'd kept hidden. His label officially terminated his contract, citing irreparable damage to his public image. His fan base, once loyal to a fault, turned on him, leaving his social media accounts a wasteland of angry comments and dwindling followers. I thought watching his downfall would bring me closure, but it didn't. If anything, it left me feeling hollow. Revenge had its place, but it couldn't rebuild what I'd lost. Emily remained a ghost, her absence both a relief and a reminder of the betrayal. A mutual friend mentioned she'd moved out of town, possibly to avoid the fallout from the scandal. I didn't ask for details. She wasn't part of my life anymore, and I intended to keep it that way. One evening, as I sat in the quiet of my living room, I found myself scrolling through photos on my phone. There were pictures of Emily and me smiling and happy, or at least pretending to be. Then there were pictures of Carter and me as kids, laughing in our backyard or posing in front of our dad's old truck. The memories were a bittersweet reminder of what we once had before it all went wrong. I decided to take a step forward. I reached out to an old friend from my military days, Mark, who'd always been a voice of reason when life got chaotic. He answered on the second ring, his familiar voice immediately grounding me. "Jack," he said, his tone warm. "Been a while. How are you holding up?" I told him everything. The affair, the stolen song, the public confrontation. He listened without interrupting, letting me unload the weight I'd been carrying. When I finally finished, Mark let out a low whistle. "Man, you've been through it. But let me ask you this, what now?" "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "I mean, you've burned that bridge. Carter's out of your life and Emily's gone. So what's next for you? What do you want to build now that the rubble's cleared?" His question stuck with me long after we ended the call. What did I want to build? I hadn't thought about the future in a long time. For months, my focus had been on survival. First the marriage, then the betrayal, then the fallout. But now I had a clean slate. The next morning, I grabbed a notebook and started jotting down ideas. Things I wanted to do, places I wanted to see, goals I'd once had but abandoned along the way. It was a messy list, scattered and chaotic, but it was a start. One of the first things I wrote down was music. For years, I'd let that part of me slip away, convinced it wasn't important. But music had always been an outlet, a way to process my emotions and tell my story. I decided to pick up my guitar again, even if it was just for myself. As I played, the notes felt like a balm, soothing wounds I hadn't realized were still open. It reminded me of who I was before the betrayal, before the anger consumed me. I wasn't fully healed, and I didn't expect to be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild something meaningful from the ashes. Weeks passed, and life slowly started to settle into a new rhythm. The public fallout from the scandal had died down, though Carter's name continued to crop up in gossip columns and the occasional news segment. He tried to make a comeback with a new single, one that had flopped miserably. It wasn't just a failure. It was a reminder of his broken career and crumbling public image. His once glamorous life was now an embarrassing spectacle. I didn't feel the same satisfaction anymore. Watching him spiral was no longer about vindication. It was about witnessing the consequences of his own choices. I could have kept going after him, digging deeper into his mistakes, but I realized something important. I didn't need to. He had already destroyed himself. Emily's silence remained unbroken. It seemed like she had vanished entirely, her presence erased from every part of my life. I couldn't even bring myself to hate her anymore. The betrayal she had inflicted was brutal, but what hurt most was how little it seemed to affect her. She moved on with her life as if nothing had happened, as if our years together meant nothing at all. There were days when I found myself longing for closure, a final confrontation where I could confront her, demand answers, force her to explain why. But deep down, I knew it wasn't about her. It was about me, and I didn't need her to make it right. I had already taken the necessary steps to reclaim my dignity, even if it came at the cost of losing everything I thought I knew about love and loyalty. But then, one evening, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my first instinct was to ignore it. However, something compelled me to walk to the door. I opened it to find Emily standing there, looking hesitant and fragile, her eyes a little red as though she had been crying. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The years of hurt, anger, and betrayal hung heavy in the air between us. She took a deep breath before finally breaking the silence. "Jack," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I need to talk to you. I owe you that much." I didn't invite her in. I wasn't ready for that kind of intimacy yet. Instead, I nodded, allowing her to continue. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice cracking. "I can't explain why I did what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't even expect you to want to hear me out. But I need you to know that I was broken, and I didn't know how to fix myself. I thought maybe you were the problem. But I was wrong. I was the one who lost myself." She paused, her eyes searching mine for a response. But I had none. There was no anger left in me, just the quiet echo of what once was. "I don't know what I want from you," she continued, her voice steadying. "I just needed you to know that I was wrong. About everything. About us. About me." The silence between us stretched on for what felt like an eternity. There was nothing left to say. Not from me, at least. I finally spoke, my voice calm but firm. "You've made your choices, Emily, and I've made mine." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know." Without another word, she turned and walked away. I didn't watch her go. There was no need to. It was over. The past was gone. The days after Emily's visit felt strangely weightless. For a moment, I thought there would be some profound sense of finality, but there wasn't. The air didn't shift, and I didn't wake up the next morning with a sense of clarity or peace. It was just life. It had moved on, and so had I, in a way. I spent more time with the guitar, reconnecting with a part of me that had been dormant for far too long. The music didn't fix everything, but it gave me a way to express the things I couldn't put into words. It became my therapy, my way of reclaiming who I was outside of the pain and the fallout from my past. One afternoon, while I was rehearsing, I felt an odd sense of calm wash over me. Maybe it was the music, or maybe it was the realization that I no longer needed anyone's validation, not Emily's or Carter's or anyone else's. I had come through this storm stronger, even if I hadn't expected it. I began to play a song I hadn't touched in years. It was the one I had written during my time in the military, before everything had gotten so messy. It had always been a reminder of who I was before the betrayal, before the love turned to ashes. But now, as I played the familiar chords, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like freedom. I wasn't looking for closure, not from anyone. I had to let go of the past in order to move forward. And as I strummed the final chord, I realized that was what I had been missing all along. The ability to move on, to forgive myself, and to find peace. A few weeks later, I was invited to perform at a small charity event. It wasn't glamorous, but it was something I hadn't done in a long time. Performing for an audience, sharing my music. I accepted without hesitation, eager to step into this new chapter of my life. The event went well. The crowd was warm, the applause genuine. And for the first time in years, I felt like I was doing something just for me. As I left the stage that night, a sense of pride settled in my chest. Not because of the performance, but because of what it symbolized. I had survived. There would always be scars from the betrayal, from the hurt. But they were no longer the defining parts of my story. I was no longer Jack, the betrayed husband or the angry brother. I was Jack, a man who had learned how to rebuild himself from the ground up. I knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be moments of doubt, moments when I'd wonder if I had truly moved on. But I also knew that I was stronger now, that I had the strength to face whatever came next. And maybe, just maybe, there was a future waiting for me. A future I was finally ready to embrace. Thank you for following this journey. What do you think of Jack's path to healing and redemption? Do you think he will ever fully recover from the betrayal? Or is forgiveness impossible in situations like this? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button for more stories of resilience, revenge, and second chances.